History Talk with Smith Co. Hello and welcome to History Talk. Today we're going to be talking about the Conservatives' support of unionists. So, while the Liberals were, they were a little bit more, prone to democracy, they were a little bit more prone to not being imperialistic scum. The Conservatives, however, were not. The Conservatives, the British Conservatives, I should say, enthusiastically supported the unionists. And that was strange because they did this even when the unionists were talking about using force. See, generally, the Conservatives actually prided themselves on upholding the law. But the problem, I guess, with the Democratic parties in England was at this time, you don't really have a way of being very, you don't have really a way of being like, okay, so we've got ourselves an empire where we generally abuse our, citizens of the countries that we rule over on a regular basis. And the problem is at this point is that the Conservatives are in a way kind of in a problematic position because at this time they're imperialistic, but they're also are conservatives. So they're in that strange area where they're like, well, you should be more protected by your citizens instead of taking over other countries. But, that's the problem. So by 1912 to 1914, things had become very different. The Conservative Party was in disarray. It had lost 3 general elections in a period of time, and it also lost its stronghold, the House of Lords, when, it hadn't lost it, but it had lost the power that the House of Lords had originally had. So the party was actually very deeply divided, and one of the very few issues the members could actually agree on was the keeping of the empire. And this time, one of the main issues of keeping with the empire was, the Irish attempt to get home rule. So, in 1912, the Conservatives got a brand new leader by the name of Andrew Bourne Law. His family came originally from Ulster, and that made him more committed to the unionists rather than the previous Conservative leaders, who had more just been sort of like, oh, well, we'll side with you. Now, in 1912, at a rally of British unionists, he then proclaimed to them, "If an attempt was made without the clearly expressed will of the people of this country, and as part of a corrupt Parliament bargain, to deprive these men of their birthright, they would be justified in resisting by all means in their power, including force. I can imagine no length of resistance to which Ulster can go, in which I would not be prepared to support them." Now, obviously, they're talking about the Irish unionists, and, that's a strange speech for, a member of another country's government to make. So, in the speech, Law set out one of the 2 main reasons why British unionists opposed Home Rule in 1912. Now, in his opinion, one of the reasons was the belief that the Home Rule Bill was part of a corrupt bargain between Redmond and the Liberals. And the only legitimate way was to decide about Home Rule, they argued, was to let the British people vote on it in a referendum. They wanted a referendum because they believed the majority of British voters would back them. Now, of course, it's a bit of a problematic situation to be saying, oh yes, that country we took over without their consent. Well, I was thinking, how about we vote on giving them back their freedom? That's a kind of a twisted mentality there. It's not really corrupt bargains, which it is, not being imperialistic scum, the second reason that he believed was the reason that the British unionists opposed Home Rule was that, in his opinion, it would be unjust to expel unionists from the United Kingdom, deprive them of their British citizenship, and leave them to the mercy of Irish Catholics. Irish Protestants were, after all, the one section of the Irish people who had always remained loyal to the British. And this argument, it particularly worried the Liberal MPs. You see, although in 1912, 1913, 1914, the British and Irish unionists issued pamphlets and organised, speeches and demonstrations throughout Britain, they also hammered away at these points. There were many influential supporters, including the senior army officers and wealthy businessmen, and many members of the House of Lords. Now, there is, of course, a solution that comes up, and that is known as partition. The Unionists hoped to win over enough voters in Britain to persuade the Liberals to give up Home Rule. However, they were intelligent enough to realise that the British Conservatives were all well and good, but the problem was the British Conservatives were somewhat arrogant, and they didn't think of a fallback position, and that was what the Unionists thought of, and that was partition. Their idea was that Ireland would be divided into two parts. Ulster would remain part of the United Kingdom, while the rest of Ireland could have Home Rule. Obviously, it's still technically part of the United Kingdom, but you know. Partition appealed more to Craig than to Carlson. Wealthy Belfast businessman, Craig believed that 890,000 Ulster Unionists with their thriving industry would manage very well with the rest of Ireland. But of course, to others, this would seem a bit dodgy. But, of course, you could argue that this would have worked because Ireland itself was not that prosperous. And the main area where prosperousness was, of course, in Ulster, and in particular in Belfast. Which is strange because it's one of the only key areas where you actually have any industry. Now, furthermore, Carlson was not in favour of this. He was a dogman. He did not want partition. This would leave around 250,000 Southern Unionists at the mercy of a massive nationalist majority. Because while you might think that, you know, the Unionists in Ulster and the Nationalists in the rest of Ireland together made a minority for Unionists, if you cut out the Ulster Unionists, the amount of people who are Unionists in, you know, the south of Ireland are a dramatic difference when you come to this sort of area here. So, he was, however, willing to talk about partition because he hoped that Redmond would give up Home Rule rather than agree to it. Of course, that argument is a little bit shaky. I mean, you know, you can hardly, I understand why you might think that, but in realistic terms, what you're being told there, what you're saying there is like, so he'd rather have nothing than to split up the country and have something, you know. Not going to be an especially, likely thing to happen. Anyway. But, yeah, I guess it's fair enough. Now, you might be thinking that, you know, at this moment, it's getting pretty close, and you're going to begin to think, you know, what about these Unionists? Should we do something about them? And Asquith and Beryl did think that. They asked Redmond what to do about the Unionist campaign. Now, Redmond then shows he had a little bit of idiocy here when he advised them to leave the Unionists alone. And obviously, because they thought, oh, well, Redmond's in Ireland, Redmond is the Irish politician, he should know these things, they did just that. And now, there were various reasons for this. Unionists seemed to be a small minority in Ireland as a whole. In 1912, they had only 19 seats compared to the 84 held by Home Rulers. The Liberals and Nationalists, it seemed kind of undemocratic that such a small minority would actually block the will of the majority. Like most nationalists, Redmond knew very little about Ulster Unionists, and he underestimated the intensity of their resistance to Home Rule and the strength of the UVF. See, traditional Unionists had always been law-abiding. Liberals and Nationalists could not believe that they were intending on using force. They thought Carlson and Craig were merely bluffing, and they would accept Home Rule once the Parliament had actually passed it. The RIC had always watched Nationalists, and, you know, they should have been watching Unionists, but due to various reasons, including kind of racism, they didn't. As a result, they had very few informers on the Unionist community, and were not able to tell the government much about the growth of the UVF. This meant that, you know, even if Redmond had advised this, if they had actually been watching the Unionists, they might have been able to tell on the people in London how strong they actually were. But they weren't. Asquith was famous for saying, well, he wasn't famous for saying, but one of his famous sayings was, wait and see. Always afraid of the put-off problems, hoping that they would go away. Beryl, who was the chief secretary, was supposed to be running Ireland, was often absent because his wife was dying. This meant that 2 men were actually in charge of Ireland, did nothing to stop the crisis until it was completely out of control. Now, in the next video, we'll be talking about the nationalist opinion when it comes to partition. So please do join us then, or you can view other videos. You can do both actually. And if you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, that would be a great help, as would viewing other videos. And if you don't view other videos and you don't come back next time, well, I'll simply say this: enjoy the rest of your existence, and bye forever.